Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, which I don't think is very many people, I'm Josh, and I'm one of the organizers for this year's Quantitative Seminar. Before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and read UW's land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all bands and tribes within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Now to introduce our speaker today. So this is Zoe. Zoe's a PhD student in the Quantitative Ecology and Resource Management program and is in the branch lab here at SAFS, where she studies the population dynamics of baleen whales, primarily using historical data like whaling records. She has a master's from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in marine mammal science, where she studied southern resident killer whales using passive acoustics. Before that, she studied humpback whale acoustics as part of her post-batch work at Oregon State University in fisheries and wildlife science. She also has a BA from Mount Holyoke College. And today she'll be presenting her work from the first chapter of her PhD. So Zoe will take questions as we go. So thank you everyone for coming, and my pleasure to introduce Zoe.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Josh, for that introduction. Yeah, feel free to interrupt me, ask questions as we go. Online folks will take your questions at the end because I can't keep track of who's asking questions, but feel free to send them in. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about estimating movement rates of Antarctic blue whales using Bayesian mark recovery models. And before I begin, I just want to thank my co-authors, Trevor Branch and Jennifer Jackson, and the International Whaling Commission for the data for this project. The Antarctic blue whale is the longest, heaviest, and loudest singing animal on the Earth. The longest scientifically measured blue whale was 98 feet long. So for folks in Seattle, you might recognize these double long buses. So 1.5 of those is about the length of a blue whale. And they typically weigh 100 to 150 tons. The one has been reported to weigh about 200 tons. And I'm from Chicago, so I need to have a Chicago example for that. So this is the Chicago bean sculpture made by Sir Anish Kapoor, and it's made of 168 stainless steel plates, and it weighs more than 100 tons. And the Antarctic blue whale calls are on average about 189 decibels, which is about as loud as a jet engine taking off. Yeah.
How do you weigh a blue whale?
And I do not know the answer. So the question was, how do you weigh a blue whale? And I actually don't know the answer to that, but Trevor might know the answer.
Bit by bit.
Trevor's answer was bit by bit. Yeah, great question. So their size, not their loudness, I just threw that in there because I think it's cool, made them the principal target of commercial whaling in the 20th century. So before that, their size and speed actually prevented them from being hunted too much. But by the 20th century, the technology caught up to them. When they were hunted, they were flensed, which means that their blubber was stripped from their bodies, and then that was melted down for oil. A single 90-foot blue whale could produce about 120 barrels of oil. So here you can see the location of Antarctic blue whale catches on the left and their population trajectory on the right. And as you can see, the Antarctic blue whales were caught throughout the Southern Ocean. Over 330,000 whales were caught, and they were brought nearly to the brink of extinction. During their last assessment, Antarctic blue whales were found to be close to only 1% of their pre-exploitation levels, but they are recovering. But at such low numbers, effective management is really essential. In order to conserve biodiversity, it's important to manage at the population level, not just at the species or the subspecies level. And that's especially true in cases like this, when populations are small and at risk of extinction. But we don't know what the population structure of Antarctic blue whales looks like. Are Antarctic blue whales a single population? So previous studies have tried to answer this question using acoustics and genetic data. And passive acoustics, especially call and song characteristics, have been used to distinguish populations of other blue whales. So for instance, pygmy blue whales have 5 populations, each that have a distinct song type. And so passive acoustics would suggest that Antarctic blue whales are a single circumpolar population because they share a single song type that's heard throughout the Southern Ocean. Genetic studies, however, may suggest that there are different populations. A 2016 genetic study claimed there were 3 populations of Antarctic blue whales, but when they tried to identify individuals to those populations, they weren't able to do so with any high degree of confidence. So the results from that study are a little bit more ambiguous. But there's a rich historical data source that has not been yet used to answer this question. Well, before now, has now. And that is a set of data from historic mark recovery experiments in the Southern Ocean. So the marks were metal rods about 10 inches long. You can see a drawing of what they looked like here. And they were pointed on one end. They had a unique serial number and instructions for returning them. They were fired into the dorsal muscles of whales. And then when the whales were flensed and melted down, the metal rod didn't melt, so it could be recovered and returned. And so before this, the only way this data had been analyzed was by calculating straight line distances between the marking and recovery locations. But we can also use this data to help us understand population structure in the Southern Ocean. We have mark recovery data, so we can try to fit a mark recovery model, specifically a multi-state mark recovery model. Multi-state mark recovery models have been used in other species to estimate migration and movement rates between particular areas. Because there's no obvious geographic barriers to blue whale movement in the Southern Ocean, we had to split the marks. We had to just choose what states to use to split our marks. And so we decided on splitting it by the 3 ocean basins that make up the Southern Ocean. So the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian. And these are very rough designations of where those splits happen, not completely exact. But the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans will be in this color scheme throughout the rest of the presentation, so you can keep track of them that way. And we especially wanted to look at the rates of movement between the whaling seasons, because many Antarctic blue whales leave the Antarctic during the winter months. They undergo a north-south migration. And so looking at between season movement would help us to see whether whales return to the same basin they were in the previous year, or if they move basins. We expected that if we saw high probabilities of movement between the ocean basins, then that would not provide enough geographic separation to create distinct Antarctic blue whale populations, but that if we saw low probabilities of movement between the 3 basins, then we might infer that there is some level of site fidelity to particular basins, which could lead to population structure. So a little bit more about the data. So Antarctic blue whales were not the only whales that were marked. Other exploited whales like fin whales were also marked, but this is just information for the Antarctic blue whales, and it also only includes the marks that were placed and recovered in different seasons. And also I just said the word season, so you might be wondering what that means. Southern Ocean whaling seasons run from July to June the following year. So if you're imagining a calendar, there's a January in the middle there. So that means they cover 2 years. So July 1926 to June 1927 would be one season, but I'm going to refer to the seasons just using that start year. So that season that I just said would be the 1926 whaling season. And I will definitely use the words year and season interchangeably throughout this presentation, but they mean the same thing. They mean that shorthand. I'm not suddenly referring to calendar years. Okay, so marks started being placed in 1926, and then the last marks were placed in 1963, and then the last Antarctic blue whale mark was recovered in 1966. And just for a little context, the International Whaling Commission started protecting Antarctic blue whales in 1964, but there was illegal whaling by the Soviets until 1973. So some of those later mark recoveries happened during that illegal whaling. And a total of 2,110 Antarctic blue whales were marked, whose marks were not caught were recovered in the same season, and 46 of those marks were recovered. Okay. So now I'm going to walk you through the model. So first we have an equation that predicts the number of marks that were originally marked in the Atlantic and currently in the Atlantic. So the way to read these indexes is that all of the marks were grouped based on the location in which they were originally placed. So there are 3 groups, one belongs to each of the ocean basins. And then at this time step, so these T's refer to the time step, which is a whaling season, they can be in any of the 3 basins. So this tells you where they are. And I'm only going to show you an example for whales released in the Atlantic that are in the Atlantic currently, but just know that I did this for all 9 pairs. And so the number of whales that are marked that are in the Atlantic in year T+1 depends on the number of whales in that group. So marks that were released in the Atlantic in any other basin J in time T. But those whales have to not be harvested in time T. So this is a basin and time specific harvest rate. And they also can move around. So this is a movement rate from any of the other basins into the Atlantic, and that includes staying in the Atlantic. So if this can be the Atlantic. Yeah, and they also have to survive. So that's a natural survival term outside of the harvest mortality. So once we know how many marks are available to be recovered in each basin and year, we then want to know how many marks are recovered in each basin and year. And so these indexes are the same. This is the group, this is the basin, and this is the year. And so obviously it depends on what we just calculated, the number of marks that are available. It also depends on a harvest rate, because in order for the marks to be recovered, the whales have to be hunted. And so there's that. And then it also depends on a loss rate. So the marks, this is saying that the marks were not lost. So that loss rate is just a singular parameter and includes physical loss of tags, so the mark fell out, or non-reporting of marks, which could be both they never found the mark when they got the whale, or they found the mark but they never returned it. So that loss rate includes all of those. And then once whales are recovered, we update the number of available marks by any new marks that were released in that basin in that year. So here's just all those equations again. And so the predicted number of recovered marks from each group in each basin in each year was fit to the actual number of recovered marks in each group in each basin in each year with a Poisson likelihood. Yeah, so that's the model, the mark recovery model. And it seems pretty straightforward, except for one particularly challenging part, and that is these harvest rates. So whaling data is very detailed in many ways. For many of the whales that were caught, we have information about their length, their sex, their stomach contents, whether they were pregnant, the sex of any fetuses they have, lots of really detailed record keeping about the whales, not a lot of detailed record keeping about effort. So we don't really have information about whaling effort. We know that Antarctic blue whale catches varied in space and time. So this is a plot with whaling season on the X and the number of catches on the Y, and they're split by the 3 basins. And so you can see here that whaling was a lot earlier in the Atlantic than it was in any of the other basins, and that most of the whales were caught in the Indian and very few were caught in the Pacific. Modern whaling nations like Norway and the UK were much closer to the Atlantic, so it's possible that they got there earlier, it was easier to access, and also the Pacific was close to whaling in some years. So it's likely that this pattern in catches is due to changing effort. But even if whaling effort was completely uniform across space and time, we could still get this pattern if whale abundance was different in space and time, if that varied in space and time, because maybe there are just way more whales in the Indian and that's why they caught more whales in the Indian, but they were putting in the same amount of effort. And so in order to estimate a harvest rate, we need to estimate abundance. And yeah, so in order to convert these raw catches into a harvest rate, we need an abundance estimate. So for that, we need a population model. And Theta-Logistic Population Model seems like a good choice. It's commonly used for baleen whale population modeling. But we can't just estimate population abundance outside of our mark recovery model, because any population model we use inherently includes an assumption about population structure. So for instance, if I just estimated the population size in the total Southern Ocean, all of the Antarctic blue whales, then I'm assuming that they're one population. If I estimate 3 separate population models, one for each ocean basin, then I'm assuming that they're 3 distinct populations. So I need this population model to also be consistent with our mark recovery model and the movement rates that are in both of those, which means that I need an integrated population model. So if you went to any quantitative seminars last year, you probably heard a bit about integrated population models. It's essentially a way to combine information from multiple data sources when you're estimating your parameters. So it allows you to combine demographic and population models and share parameters between them. So we integrated our mark recovery model and our population model so that we could estimate those harvest rates while keeping things like movement and survival consistent across both models. And the mark recovery part of the model is exactly the same as what I already showed you. So don't worry, we're not doing those equations again. But I will explain the population side of the model a little bit. So this is a Theta-Logistic population model with catches. And if you're not used to looking at a Theta-Logistic population model, you can just kind of pretend you don't see this exponent, and then it should probably look like what you're familiar with. So here's your intrinsic growth rate, here's your carrying capacity, and here are your catches. And then this little exponent just means that the maximum sustainable yield level happens at 60% of carrying capacity. And that's just common practice when modeling population dynamics of baleen whales. It's used by the International Whaling Commission. So we did that just to be consistent with that. We did reparameterize the model in a couple of ways. One of the ways that we did that was to explicitly include survival. So as you remember, there was that little S term in the mark recovery model that was natural survival. And there is survival happening in a logistic growth equation, but it's sort of like under the hood. And so this way we're like making it so that the survival is explicitly consistent across both models. And then we also reparameterized it with MSY, or maximum sustainable yield, and that's because R and K are inherently correlated. So depending on what your R is, you only have a certain number of Ks that could be possible, and that can make convergence in a Bayesian estimation framework very difficult. And so this is exactly the same equation, but we just solved this equation for K, substituted in there. And so this helps with convergence. So it doesn't change the model at all. It just helps it go faster. Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I here is ocean basins. So we did this for each of the ocean basins, and then this is the same season year term. And so once we have like growth and catches, then the whales get to move around. So once again, this is just an example for Atlantic, but I did do this for all of the basins. And whales that were in the Atlantic can stay in the Atlantic with some probability, and then they can also move from whatever basin they were in that was not the Atlantic into the Atlantic. And these are the exact same movement rates that are in the mark recovery model. And then the, so there we go. Yeah, so there's these little KIs, these are carrying capacity for each basin. But if you kind of remember that population model I showed, where carrying capacity kind of depends on how much movement there is between the populations. And so we instead of estimating 3 basin specific carrying capacities, we estimated one total basin one total Southern Ocean, there we go, carrying capacity. And then we split it into basin specific carrying capacities using the equilibrium distribution of the movement rates. So the movement rates make a matrix, and you can get a stationary distribution of that matrix. If anyone wants more information about that, I can talk about that more. And then once we know how many whales are in each basin in each year, we can fit that to our actual abundance estimates using a log normal likelihood. We had a couple of different sets of abundance estimates, and some of them didn't cover, they're from line transect surveys, and some of the surveys didn't cover in the entirety of ocean basin, of the ocean basins. And so for those, we have this Q term, which basically converts it to that partial estimate. And for those, we didn't estimate Qs, we actually calculated them using their like maximum likelihood estimation derivation. And so those are calculated, they're not estimated. And then this sigma data term here is just based on the CV of the abundance estimates themselves. There's no additional variance that's calculated. Okay, so now we have catches, we have abundance in each basin and year. So now we can finally get those harvest rates in each basin and year, and those harvest rates go into the mark recovery model for those little H's. Yeah. So that was a lot of equations. So I'm just going to kind of summarize all of that in a visual way to hopefully make sure everyone is clear on it. So we have these predicted abundances in each basin and year, and they depend on growth, catches, carrying capacity, movement, and survival. And then those help us to calculate harvest rates, which are used to predict mark recoveries in each basin and year and group. And those also depend on the movement parameters, the survival, the loss parameter, and then any new marks that are released. And then the abundance predictions are fit to the abundance estimates using a log normal likelihood. And the recovery predictions are fit to the mark recovery data using a Poisson likelihood. All right, so that makes sense. Cool. So I sort of mentioned this before, but I did use Bayesian methods. And that means that I have priors for my estimated parameters. So these are just the priors that I used. For R, which is our growth rate, I have a uniform prior between 0 and 0.114, and that's just based on biological limits of R for baleen whales. For the carrying capacity for the Southern Ocean, because I only estimated one total one, I estimated in log space, so that's why this is uniform between 9 and 13, and those are based on a little bit higher than previously estimated and a little bit lower than it would be possible for it to be without the population going extinct. And we know the population didn't go extinct because there's still blue whales out there. We also have, we estimated 6 of the movement probabilities. We estimated the movement probabilities for the basins that don't match. So any probability of moving from one basin to another basin. And we limited those probabilities had a prior of uniform 0 to 0.34. And that was because anything higher than that would suggest that whales preferentially avoid areas that they were in the previous year, which doesn't make sense in a Southern Ocean feeding ground, which is a very plentiful and stable food source. And so it would be very unlikely that a whale would avoid a previously successful foraging ground. And then this probabilities of staying, we actually calculated by subtracting them from 1, because essentially, if you can imagine, if you're in the Atlantic in one year, you have to either end up in the Atlantic, Indian, or Pacific in the next year. So those probabilities have to sum to 1. So we used the ones that are calculated by subtraction are the probabilities of staying. And then we also have this mark loss rate, which we used a beta 1,1 prior, which is a traditional binomial vague prior. So as I just said, we calculated the probabilities of staying by subtraction. We fixed natural survival to 0.96, and that is based on previous estimates of natural survival. And that was just so we had one less parameter to estimate. And then we calculated those Q terms using their maximum likelihood. Here's my Bayesian stuff. I use Stan. I can talk about this more if anyone wants to know, but it's there. Great, time for some results. Okay, so first to orient you to these plots. So you're looking at the prior in the dashed lines, and the posteriors are the solid lines with the shading. The shading represents 95% credible intervals, and there is a median line in here, but it's skinny and you can't see it. But yeah, so this is the full range So this is our carrying capacity parameter, and the numbers are in real scale, but this is a plot of the log of carrying capacity. It's just that our brains don't think in log numbers, so I put them in real numbers so we can see them. And that's also true here. So this is the actual estimate that we got of log carrying capacity, but then I just converted them to numbers that our brains will understand. Yeah, so this is carrying capacity. This is a zoomed in version, so you can see that line. And the median was 195,000. And this is smaller than previously estimated carrying capacities. For instance, Trevor has a 2004 paper where he has a credibility interval of like 200 to 300,000 for Southern Ocean carrying capacity. And we think that this difference is probably explained a little bit by our estimate of R. So you can see that our estimate of R is the median is about 8% or 7.6%. And this is pretty high on the range of possibilities. And the higher the R, the lower the carrying capacity needs to be before the population goes extinct. So we think that might be partially explained by that, but then it also could partially be explained by our movement rates, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Yeah, and this is the posterior for R. And yeah, and so then we also have that mark loss rate, that one loss parameter, and it's pretty high. So this is the full range of the prior, and then here's the zoomed in version of the posterior. And yeah, it was estimated the median was about 97.5%. So that's really high. But if you think about the fact that we had about 2,000 marks and only 46 were recovered, we were expecting a pretty high loss rate. Yeah, so here's, oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so Trevor was just saying that that loss rate is an interseason loss rate. So any marks that were lost, like recaptured within the season, are also essentially lost from the model. Yeah. Okay, so here's what we're mostly interested in. These are the estimated movement rates, and this is just a plot of the posteriors, but the credible intervals are the shading, the 95% credible intervals are the shading, and then the medians are the lines. And so right away, just looking at this, you can see that the posteriors are pretty broad, and that makes sense because we have 46 recoveries out of 2,000 marks. So we don't have there's not an overwhelming amount of information about all of these parameters. Generally, there was pretty high probabilities of returning to the same basin that you were in. And remember, because of the way that we set these up, the probability of staying has to be 0.34 or greater, essentially. And that's why there's that like split sort of down the middle of the plot, because of the way that we made these parameters have to be less than 0.34. And yeah, so there's generally high probabilities of returning to the same basin. And our lowest probability of movement was from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That's about 7-8%. But it probably doesn't matter too much because there's really high probabilities of moving in the other direction. So from the Atlantic to the Pacific, there's a pretty high probability. And then there's equally high probabilities of moving between the Pacific and Indian in either direction. So basically that means that there's a relatively frequent movement throughout the Southern Ocean. And just to look at the population trajectories, so these are posterior distributions of the population in each basin and year. The basins are color-coded the same way. The credible intervals are 95% credible intervals, those are shading. And these two plots are exactly the same. This one's just on a log 10, the population size is on a log 10 scale, so it's easier to see. But what's kind of interesting about this is that the lowest carrying capacity was predicted in the Atlantic and the highest was predicted in the Pacific. And in one way, this could help explain our lower total carrying capacity, because if you remember, much fewer whales were caught in the Pacific. And so if there's a lot of whales in the Pacific, then you can have a higher total carrying capacity before or a lower total carrying capacity before the population goes extinct because fewer of those whales are being caught. But it's a little bit counterintuitive because catches started later in the Pacific, and there were fewer total catches. And so if there was just like a lot of whales in the Pacific, that's sort of counterintuitive that they wouldn't just go there and hunt them. But we think that this can be explained by those high movement rates, because basically after only a few years, the depletion rate would be the same basically throughout the entire Southern Ocean. So it wouldn't really matter how many whales started in the Pacific.
I was going to get your question. Whales in the, it seemed like there was high chance of moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or we were moving once they were losing whales from the Atlantic. That one?
Yeah.
Like they're leaving that and not coming back.
Hold on to that question because I am going to talk about that a little bit. But if you still have that question later, let me know. Okay. Okay, so this is just to look at model fit. So these are posterior predictive plots. And so the data are these bars, and then the points with the lines through them are the posterior predictive distributions. The model fit looks generally pretty good. I also think that this is also apparent why some of our movement posteriors are very broad, because for instance, no marks that were placed in the Atlantic were recovered in the Pacific, and none that were placed in the Pacific were recovered in the Atlantic. So there's basically no information in the data about those two. So that also can help explain why our movement posteriors are pretty broad. Okay, yeah, this is just model fit to the abundance estimates. The violin plots are the posterior predictive distributions, and then the points are the actual abundance estimates. And we had two sets of them from Trevor's 2007 paper, and then from these Matsuoka and Hakamada 2014 papers. And once again, model fit looks pretty good. Okay, so this is the question. Are Antarctic blue whales a single population? And remember, we care about this because we want to know what Antarctic blue whale population structure looks like in order to manage them and their recovery more effectively. So what do these movement estimates have to do with our population? And so to look at how those movement estimates translate into population mixing, I ran a very, very basic simulation where I said 100 whales start in the Atlantic and then they move according to their movement rates. But there's no growth, there's no catches, nothing happens except movement, and it happens for 6 years. So we'll just see what happened in that. So after 6 years, even though no whales started in the Indian or the Pacific, there are still like 34 whales in the Indian and 41 in the Pacific. Okay, but what if they start in the Indian? So after 6 years, even if they start in the Indian, we've got almost 22 in the Atlantic and 41 in the Pacific. And then what if they start in the Pacific? Hopefully this is not too surprising, but they start in the Pacific. We have 20 in the Atlantic and 36 in the Indian after only 6 years. So are Antarctic blue whales a single population? Well, our results suggest that there's not a lot of geographic separation in the Antarctic feeding grounds that would create geographically distinct populations of Antarctic blue whales. There was a lot of population mixing, as we saw. So yeah, that's why I think that. But it doesn't rule out the possibility of population structure completely. So population structure could still exist in the Southern Ocean. If, for example, population mixing increased over time. So as like the whales were hunted, depletion spread, and then they started to move around more. We had time constant movement rates, and so we didn't allow for that in our model, but it could be possible. There also could be population, like site fidelity on finer spatial scales that were masked by our basin designation. So if there's no like site fidelity in one part of the basin, but movement in another part of the basin, we wouldn't necessarily see that site fidelity. The problem with fitting this model on a finer spatial scale is just that there wasn't like uniform marking effort and recovery effort throughout the Southern Ocean. So it would be hard to estimate parameters for a model on a finer spatial scale. And population structure could also arise in places other than the Southern Ocean or in their breeding habitats, in differences in timing of migration or in breeding behavior. There's a lot we still don't know about Antarctic blue whale breeding patterns. And so that could also be a possible avenue for population structure. More work is being done on this with satellite tags and photo IDs, and hopefully more future work happens with both of those things too, so that we can better answer those questions. So here's one more whale for making it through the talk. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Am I correct that the eigenvalue vector for your associated with the dominant eigenvalue for movement matrix should give you sort of what that stable spatial distribution is? Is that basically map onto the distribution?
Yeah, so and that's how we determined the carrying capacities in each of the basins. Oh, sorry. So for the Zoom folks, the question is if the eigenvectors, right, map onto the population distribution in those simulations. And yeah, 6 years is like a little bit before it hits the stable distribution, but it's pretty close to its stable. It doesn't change very much after that. Yeah. Are there online? Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, I guess more of a historical question about the marks. Based on reading context, et cetera, do you have any good ideas as to what could have been driving a lot of why those marks weren't found? For example, like, could a lot of that been Soviet whaling? Alien on K during the Cold War wasn't necessarily something of interest. Just like the altitude, et cetera, whatever it's marketed as.
Yeah. So the question is if there is reasoning for why so many of the marks were never recovered, and suggesting that maybe it was the illegal Soviet whaling. That's very possible. So there were there have been issues with obviously illegal whaling. They did not report either accurately or at all some of their catches, and so there has been a lot of work to like uncover the true data from those catches. So I think it's pretty possible that they might have just not returned marks that they found. Also, like, I mean, a 10-inch mark is large, but a 98-foot blue whale, like, it's very possible that they didn't find them. I think. So I don't know if Trevor has any other ideas of that, but.
When the study didn't lead away, they weren't reporting the marks that were from species that were not whale. So like after 1964, 66, the blue whales, they would not catch blue whales. They were still catching blue whales and catching marks. And every now and again they reported, oh, we got this mark and in a blue whale, and somebody would point out, well, actually that mark is placed in a blue whale or humpback was also there. Oh, we made a mistake. Sorry. It was actually, not that part. But they didn't have they were actually reporting where it was the truth. They just weren't letting everybody else know. And so later, when everything was disbanded and everything came out, it was actually a Ukrainian scientist who started publishing all of the true stuff, which kind of now, the Ukrainians just kind of with that. It all makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really interesting, like animation.
Thanks.
And I'm wondering, sorry if I missed it,
Okay.
but were marks released and recovered throughout the season? And if they were, is there any confounding potential with intra-year movement? Move between these areas within a year, and is there any sort of within year movement that at certain times of the year, they might be in the Atlantic. And they always come back to the Atlantic at that certain time, but they might be in at another time of the year. Is there confounding? Or
Yeah, so for the Zoom folks, the question was that were the marks released and recovered like within the same season, and would there be any confounding with like intra-season movement? So we did take out the marks that were recovered within the same season. So we're only looking at between season marks, but yeah, I think they were recovered across a variety of different months. So it is possible that they like returned to one basin, but then moved around the Southern Ocean. But I think that for this question, and someone can correct me if they don't think this, but I think that for this question, like that also is evidence that the populations are mixing, right? So it doesn't in particularly matter as much like if, I mean, I guess it would matter if we saw a lot of site fidelity, if it was just that they were returning and then moving, but because we're seeing so much movement, I think that that would only reinforce the idea that the populations are mixing.
Part of the issue is these are vast distances.
Yeah.
So if you place a marker in January, it's just impossible to get it all the way around the Antarctic. Unless you get it all the way around. And so a lot of the recovery after the season was like 6 weeks, 50 months long. So then no matter where you place them, there wouldn't be much time for them to go over 40 to get on the same season. We can just look at month by month.
Yeah.
If there's any differences in where there was whaling versus where they were. But
Yeah.
The whale.
Yeah, so Trevor also added that the whaling seasons were relatively short compared to the amount of time it would take to swim all the way around the Atlantic or around the Antarctic Peninsula. So just heads up, Zoom folks. Are there online questions, Josh?
There's a handful of questions. Brielle asked, why did you choose a uniform distribution for movement probability rather than estimating movement with like a Dirichlet or something?
Yeah, so why we chose a uniform distribution for the movement parameters was because we knew there wasn't a ton of information in the data, and we really wanted to constrain them to be less than like a third, 34%, so that we didn't have whales preferentially avoiding basins that they were in before, and it was easier to just constrain them using a uniform distribution. But I'm happy to talk to you more about Dirichlet if you think that would be better.
Andre has 3 questions.
Okay.
So the first one, why not model movement in local space if there as that is multiple?
Yeah, so we didn't model movement in loaded space just because they were already constrained to be less than 1, because we constrained the uniform priors that way. And also because we don't have any covariates for movement, so it's just the movement parameters themselves. And so they're already going to sum to 1 because of the way that we calculated them. But you definitely could model them in loaded space for sure.
Is there any chance that reporting rates vary spatially, since you assume spatially invariant reporting rates, i.e., is there a difference in reporting rates between fleets and different regions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about whether the reporting rates vary spatially, and that's something Trevor and I have talked about actually, and also whether they vary by country, which is kind of what we were talking about with the Soviets and the illegal whaling. And I think that would be something that's super interesting to explore. I'm not sure whether we have really enough data to explore it, but I think that would be interesting. And then there's also the idea that like marks after the first year, marks are probably unlikely to be physically lost because they're pretty well embedded. Like if any physical loss happened, then they would just like fall out pretty early. And so that could also be something to incorporate in the loss rate parameter, but we just tried to keep it as simple as possible for this version. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So based on what you talked was really about the sort of the mission of the whaling, even well, like when the Soviets were illegally whaling in the 70s, were they really just taking the blubber and that was it, or were they using more of the whale? I guess what I'm wondering, that just seems incredibly logistically expensive to me, when you could just sink a well in Eastern Russia, just sort of pumping petroleum.
Yeah, so the question is like, were they just using the blubber even in the 60s? I think they were, but maybe Trevor knows more about this. From what I read, most of the whale oil was used to make margarine. So yeah, so you know, all that margarine eating.
And depending on the country and the year, like I said, so earlier on in the 1910s, 1920s, they were just taking the blubber and just basically throw the carcass out and throw it away. And then they started doing things where they were trying to use the whole carcass, and some fleets would take the meat and sell that, and others would grind it down to form basically bone meal, use that fertilizer. The big money was the oil, always the oil, and the rest. These are big animals, so you basically fill up something and you send it back to the UK or Europe or whatever. So you got to make sure that you send back the valuable. So there were questions of how much value could you get out of the different products you made. But definitely as time went on, they used almost the whole process.
Yeah. So to summarize Trevor's comment for Zoom, they did use the whole carcass towards the end of the time that they were whaling, or they tried to at least, but the blubber was still always the most valuable part.
And they had all kinds of weird things that they had production lines like vitamin A and liver oil and all kinds of things they were trying to get, like insulin. So at various times they tried all kinds of things, but none of them well sized body.
Yeah.
Related to that, going back to the marks, is there any evidence that the Soviet Union was ever trying to do any kind of estimate study like this through marks or some other means of tracking populations for their legal/illegal entities?
I don't know about it.
Most of the marks were from the British.
Yeah.
There are sometimes did experiments. So the time when we did programs, so I had a big program. So they did do a lot of research that was all that published in secret journals, some of which has come to light and some of which has not. So there are people that go, there's a you really ever think that remember that would go and try and get data, the original data. So some of it's come to light. Some of it.
Any more online questions, Josh? Or no? Any more questions? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah.
So thanks everyone for coming to Quant today. Hopefully everyone comes next week to hear Sophia Walkerman talk about cannibalism next week.